Good evening, everyone. You could find a seat. We're going to get started in just a minute. My name is Jonah Weiss. I am the manager of public programs here at the Jewish Museum. It is my pleasure to welcome you back to this season's Unpacking the Book, Jewish Writers in Conversation. Tonight's program, Confronting Conformity, featuring Chava Stein and Goldie Goldbloom in conversation with Stephanie Butnick, is co-presented with the Jewish Book Council and Lilith Magazine. And I would like to take this opportunity to thank my collaborators at both organizations for all their work on tonight's event. For those of you who might be new to the Jewish Museum, I hope that you come back and join us for an upcoming program this season. Just want to mention a few highlights. Next week, Nicole Mitchell's Afrofuturist jazz trio Matapi will be performing on Thursday, February 27th at 7:30. On March 8th at 1 p.m., we have our third annual Wikipedia Editathon, co-presented with Art and Feminism. And on Thursday, March 5th at 6:30 p.m., a lecture by Susanna Heschel on exile and diaspora. So for updates on all of our public programs and events, please visit our website to sign up for our e-news. Now I would like to welcome Naomi Firestone Teeter, Executive Director of Jewish Book Council, who will tell you a little bit more about tonight's event.
Hi, everyone. I'm so excited to welcome you to the 6th season of Unpacking the Book, Jewish Writers in Conversation, co-presented with the Jewish Museum. The Unpacking series is truly one of the highlights of our year, a chance to bring together individuals who have written important works about Jewish life, identity, and history for meaningful conversations about Jewish community. Tonight's program, co-sponsored with the Jewish Museum, Lilith Magazine, and Tablet Magazine, promises to be a fascinating discussion between our authors, Chava Stein and Goldie Goldbloom, and our moderator, Stephanie Butnick, as they discuss the challenges of not fitting into one's community. For those of you unfamiliar with Jewish Book Council, our mission is to enrich and educate the community through Jewish literature. For public programs such as this one, awards, conferences, to essays by Jewish authors, book club resources, interviews, and reading lists, JBC provides tools for substantive conversations about Jewish life and identity. You can find out more at jewishbookcouncil.org. Before we begin tonight's program, I'd like to first ask that you silence or shut down your cell phones. I'd also be remiss if I didn't properly thank all the wonderful people and organizations that have made this evening possible. The Jewish Museum for their very generous support, specifically Jonah Weiss, our co-sponsor, Lilith Magazine, who recently featured both of tonight's authors in its pages. Lilith has always confronted conformity, opening new paths in Jewish life, so this feels like a perfect partnership. And finally, our wonderful media sponsor, Tablet Magazine, the premier publication of Jewish news and ideas in the US. And special thank you to Jewish Book Council's Board of Directors for all of their support, especially Jewish Book Council's President, James Weitzman, and President Emerita Edith Everett, who are both with us this evening. And to our Literary Society members, and of course, I'd like to thank JBC staff for all their hard work to help make tonight possible, particularly Miri Pomerantz-Stauber, who has managed all aspects of the season series. We're also grateful to you, Miri, for your work developing such a vibrant Jewish literary discussion and discussion resources, including the book club questions that are available at the book sale table. Following this evening's program, we welcome you to join us for a book sale, author signing, and reception, co-hosted by Lilith Magazine in celebration of the release of their winter issue, until 8:30. We hope that you will be as inspired as we have been by the authors on tonight's panel. So be sure to grab copies of both of their books at the end of the evening, JBC's own literary journal, Paper Brigade, as well as your complimentary copy of the winter issue of Lilith. And now I'd like to introduce you to our amazing moderator, Stephanie Butnick. Stephanie Butnick is the deputy editor of Tablet and a host of Unorthodox, the leading Jewish podcast on iTunes. She is the author, along with her co-host, of the newest Jewish encyclopedia, From Abraham to Zabars and Everything in Between, which is also on sale this evening, and she'll be happy to sign. She has written for the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, and she helped edit Tablet's forthcoming Passover Haggadah. And with that, I thank you for joining us, and have a great evening.
Thank you to, ooh, am I on? Am I on? Just yell if you can't hear me. I know you will anyway, so Thank you to Naomi and Jenna and Miri and the teams, all of the teams that helped put this amazing series together. And tonight, especially, I'm so excited to be here with Chava Stein and Goldie Goldbloom. You guys can clap for them. Let's clap for them again. Yeah. They are two wonderful writers whose books I know you're going to love, and you can conveniently buy them right over there, right after. They will even sign them, I think, right over there. So this is like a full-service operation here. So we're going to talk for a little bit, and then the authors will answer your questions, which you can write on cute little index cards that are on your seat. We'll get to that a little bit later, but I'll remind you later on during the show to write your questions as they sort of come to mind. All right. Should we do this?
Let's do it.
So these are two very different books. One is obviously a memoir. One is fiction. One is a novel. But they have a lot of the same themes. What?
I don't know how fiction your book is. How fictitious,
real.
like having read it.
It's
very real.
It's as real as I can make it while still being fiction.
Yeah.
But they have a lot of the same themes running through them about identity, community, LGBTQ acceptance or not within Jewish communities. So I'd like to get started with you each reading a bit from your book, just to give the audience a taste of the books that you can buy right after this. Abby, will you kick us off? This is from the introduction.
Yes. I'm allowed to say that you chose it?
Yeah.
Yeah, because it's a great part, don't get me wrong, but there's a few other parts that I would maybe if they come up. But it's a really good one. And I do want to say the books are set in the same place. They're both set in Hasidic Williamsburg, so there's that. And I grew up not far from Division Avenue on White. Is it better now? Okay, good. Too loud?
It's like a real Goldilocks crowd here.
Well, okay, let's find the sweet spot. Is everyone good now? Okay, good. In the fall of 1982, when my father was 17 years old, a matchmaker proposed a marriage for him with a girl from Williamsburg, Brooklyn, Chaya Shendel Meisels. The match was promising. The young couple both came from rabbinic families, and they shared a primary goal: raise a big, devoted, rabbinic Hasidic family in which all of their children would follow the path of Hasidic Judaism. My parents met once and became engaged. The wedding was set for 9 months later, December of 1983. The wedding was the talk of the town, my father recalled years later. It was attended by the biggest rabbis of the day. And so, a new family started, a Hasidic family, a royal rabbinic family, and a family that was destined to create rabbis, teachers, and leaders in the Hasidic world. And me. I was groomed from birth to follow the life cycle path of the Hasidic tradition. There was my birth and my bris, or circumcision, and then my upsharon, first haircut, and first physical distinction as a boy, at age 3. My bar mitzvah, or entrance to adulthood, took place at age 13, and I became engaged to a young bride at 18. I got married, finished my rabbinical studies, and received the first part of my rabbinical degree following intense oral exams. Then, in January 2012, when I was 20, my son was born. Having a child of my own, I saw in a new light how much we gender babies before they're even born, especially within the Hasidic community, and this made it even harder for me to come to terms with my own identity. I started looking more deeply for answers about gender and faith, questioning both, along with everything else I was taught growing up. It became more and more difficult for me to stay in the community, to stay religious, and to continue life looking like a man. The Hasidic community is, as far as my research has shown, the most gender-segregated society in the United States, and gender roles are deeply ingrained in that lifestyle. Leaving would eventually become inevitable.
Thank you. So Goldie, will you tell us a little bit about what I asked you to read?
Yes. Can you hear me all right? Is everything okay? Not yet? How about now? Is that better? Okay, I have to speak loudly. So I was asked to read a little section of my novel on division, and this little section is during the birth of the main character Surrey's the last child that was born before this book occurs, and she's sort of having a bit of a rant, a bit of a meltdown, and telling the midwife off. And so this is what she says. I'm going to have to take off my glasses because I can't see otherwise. Returning to the midwife after several circuits, Surrey had said, "Why should I scream? Why should I moan when I'm doing the exact thing I was made for? When I'm fulfilling my part in creation? Thank God I know my place in the world. The Torah speaks about many things, but always it talks about the children that come forth, the children that one is to sacrifice for. Every part of my life is turned towards children, the having of children, the raising of children. The strollers standing in the synagogue on Yom Tov, they're the Jewish people. And the yellow school buses that clog the streets in the morning, that's the Jewish people. And all of the crying babies under their father's white prayer shawls during the priestly blessing, that's the Jewish people. Their small hands, their feet, their shaven heads, their long curling payas, the sing-song of their voices. At the end of the Holocaust, when we thought no children were left, the sound of one child's cry was enough to fill every heart to overflowing. Families that didn't have money for blankets had money enough to bear children, because that was the true and only wealth of the Jewish people. When the nations of the world say that we've stolen all their riches, there's no denying it, for aren't our places of worship full of gems, and aren't our schools full of diamonds, and aren't all the beds in our homes filled with gold and silver and onyx? When they say we have the blood of Christian children in our matzahs, it is not true. We have the blood of Jewish children in our matzahs. We have the blood of Jewish children in the air we breathe. It's all that we live for. It was more words than the midwife had ever heard any of these women say, and she was ashamed. It would be many months before she would again ask a laboring woman wearing a scarf and seamed taupe stockings, in the face of her stoic silence, her lack of curiosity, her denial of exhaustion, "What is it with you women?"
If I may,
Yes.
Sorry. If I may jump in, my mom, I love that part of the blood. The matzahs have the bloods of our own kids, because we always used to say in Yiddish, how well is your Yiddish?
It's good.
Stoib is nicht kein chametz. Kinder sind nicht kein Korban Pesach.
Right.
Which
It's a classic.
translates to dust is not chametz, as in you don't have to worry about cleaning it out.
And the kids aren't the sacrifice.
Yeah, and the kids are not a sacrificial lamb, which is happens a lot during Pesach, before Passover, that the kids become the blood of the kids. It's jarring but accurate.
So my podcast co-host, Mark Oppenheimer, said your book, Goldie, this is a quote, he read it and he thought it might be the only serious fictional portrayal of the Satmar community in Anglophone literary history. Yeah, is that true?
Yes, I believe it's true.
And what does it mean to take this community really, really seriously in a work of literature? And it's not a joke, it's not a punchline.
Right.
There's complexity there.
Right. Well, I think part of the issue is that when people, traditionally, when people have written about Hasidic communities, and not just the Satmar community, but any Hasidic community, they're either people looking from the outside who don't know all the nuance, and so therefore there's lots of details that are wrong, and they also tend to cast the characters as these saintly people. They're so saintly, which, God help me for saying this, but it's not true, not saintly at all. And the opposite is true. It's also, a lot of the books are written by people who have left the community, and there are people who leave the community and they're fine with the community, but there are a lot of people who leave the community who are very bitter and angry, and so when they write, that anger makes its way into the books. And so anything that's ever been written, I think about the Hasidic community, when I read it, or somebody who's still living in the Hasidic community reads it, they just sort of go, when are we going to be written about accurately? You know, all of the different communities across the world, you hope that when somebody writes a book about you, whatever that community is, you hope that it's accurate.
Can I? Yeah. This is great. They don't even need me.
Because
I'm just going to sit in the audience.
hold on, let's see if it, I think it's in here. Yeah, here. Can I read a part here? I should say, okay. My story includes two interwoven transitions, coming out of ultra-Orthodoxy and coming out as a trans woman. The stories we read of both experiences tend to suffer from problems in the public sphere, problems that are marked by overt polarization, lack of nuance, and the romanticizing of mysterious religious sects. Several books have been written about the Hasidic community, both by people who have lived it and left, and by outsiders looking in. And most, I promise you, we did not coordinate. We did not, this is not. And most either glorify the lifestyle or demonize it. Trans representation tends to follow a similar path. There's overt sexualization and the casting of transness as mental illness, or idealized representations that focus on victimhood. Though thankfully, that's starting to change. And that's a big part what I was trying to do as well, and I remember talking with that with my editor before we even signed like the publication deal, before we got to anything, and I'm like, this is really what I want to try to avoid. And one of the most common feedback I keep getting from people who've read the book is like, I was expecting hate, and usually will come attached with, and you were allowed to. Because like I have things that were tough, but I don't. I really don't hate the community, and I was really trying to capture that.
You did a really good job, Abby.
Thank you. Yes, and so do you, obviously. But I think, and again, like I want to say, it's not. I didn't feel like it was fiction, and I want to say specifically. And I was just looking on it on the way over, on the back of the book, and you can all obviously buy her book and read it after this. But you have
take it from Abby. She's selling my book for me. Go ahead.
Well, I expect the same.
Okay. I already said you did a good job.
Thank you. But in the back, there's a family tree. And I didn't feel the same when I was reading it in English because I'm not used to reading Hasidic family trees in English. But I was reading it in Hebrew. It feels so accurate. There's obviously the sad part. There are the parts where you look on the parents and grandparents and everyone has entire families that were killed, which is literally my family. Like my grandfather lost 9 of his siblings, his mother, all 4 of his grandparents. Everyone was killed in the Holocaust. And the names, like some of the names, I actually know people who have these exact same names. It was really, really good. And as you said, that part of looking on the nuance. And I was trying to do the same of like, there are good parts, there are bad parts, there are beautiful parts, there are nasty parts, there's everything.
I mean, in a book, what you hope for is that sense of balance, where you have the accuracy of somebody's life. You know, like each one of you sitting here, you have parts of you that you present to the world that are the external parts that are really very fine and lovely, and we would all like to be just like you and certainly dress like you and definitely be your weight, etc. However, there are the other parts, the internal parts, the shadow self that you really don't get to see, even if you've lived with that person for years. You don't get to see that, and so. But that creates a balance. And so when you're walking through the streets of Williamsburg or even Manhattan and you happen to see Hasidic people walking along, what you see are these kind of perfect exteriors, and you're like, oh, they're perfect. Or they've got a ton of kids, and you're like, barefoot and pregnant, you know, those things. But what you don't see is that, you know, lift up the shell of the person. You don't get to see what's inside, which is exactly the same as you.
So speaking of sort of that balance, there's a deep loneliness that runs throughout both of these stories, the true and the fictionalized. Abby, your loneliness growing up, knowing that you're outside and you're who you were on the inside just didn't match, and not being able to share that with anyone within your community. And Suri in On Division, who has a secret pregnancy as a woman who's becoming a great-grandmother, has a tragic thing that happened to her son that she has to sort of bear alone. So there is this deep, deep loneliness that we get, but there's also this liveliness of these communities and of these families that we also see. So, I mean, we're sort of touching on this a little bit, but how do we square these two realities, the festive Shabbat meals, but also the isolation of knowing that you're not really accepted for who you are? How should readers who don't know much about this community, can we take the good and the bad together? Are we allowed?
Go ahead, I will go ahead.
I think that this exists in every community in the world. Like, I just shone a light on the Hasidic community, so did Abby. But like, I think that this idea that you could be in the middle of a warm, vibrant community, a loving community, a very spiritual community, a community that has a lot of ritual involved, and at the same time feel very isolated, many communities are like that. I want to say all communities are like that. If you don't fit into your community, whether that's the Manhattan community, the intelligentsia of Manhattan, or wherever it is, if you don't fit in, you feel yourself to be isolated. That's a universal story, right?
It is. I mean, I think specifically in the Hasidic community, it's almost like a value. I grew up with a message that was always, and I was told that's the basis, though some even Hasidic groups don't necessarily follow that, but we were always told that the best, the holiest, or the most accomplished way of fasting is while you're eating a bowl of soup. The most accomplished way of doing something called Gilgul Shelek, which means rolling yourself in the snow, which is in mystic Judaism that was perceived as a certain punishment that people would take up upon themselves, which is like get naked and roll yourself in the snow. And they would say the highest form of doing that is doing that under your blanket in your bed. And then finally, the highest form of something called hisbodedus, which is being alone. And there are some Hasidic people go out in the forest and be alone with God. But we were always told the highest way of being alone is being surrounded by people while you are surrounded by people. And sometimes that's a value, but at the end of the day, yes, that happens. I think about the yeshiva that I went to, kind of like high school / seminary / college / rabbinical school. It's the best way I can describe it. And I went to in the Catskills, and we were with 400 students 24/7. Yet sometimes I loved it, and sometimes you felt like you had friends, and I also kind of had a boyfriend there. We'll let you buy the book to figure out all the details of that. That was not allowed in case it's not obvious.
That's so not cool, Abby. Drop the juicy tidbit right in front and then go, by the way, I'm going to walk away now.
That's the point, right? I'm trying to get you. But all of that is coming together to this point of yes, and I think everyone in the community. And sometimes, though, to be honest, and you're right, that exists everywhere as well, but specifically because it's a community that is so centered around family and community life. Like you're talking, Hasidic men are expected to go to synagogue 3 times a day. And talking about not exoticizing it, most Hasidic men that I knew growing up, yes, they went to pray also, but it was about the social scene. There's almost like you're forced to socialize, and there's such big families, and sometimes that causes you to be alone. At least that's how I felt. Because it was such a big community, because it was so close, ended up being so far.
And something that happens, Abby, in your story is that we see your unhappiness really spike when it comes to these times and places where gender and performing gender is highlighted. And that is actually a lot in the life of a Hasidic child. There's the looming bar mitzvah, there's the segregated synagogue seating. It seems like almost every day you're being sent to one of 2 places. So I guess I'm curious, do you think growing up in a community with such deeply ingrained gender roles sort of impacted how you experienced your gender dysphoria?
Do you follow me on Facebook?
No, but I'm going to.
Because I'm allowed to read something? Yeah. I literally just posted about that a few days ago. And if you give me a second. And it was actually from a review. Oh, I don't have service here. Okay, it's going to take too long. I don't care. I could probably do Wi-Fi, but it's not that important. But there was a review. Oh, and I think in like this Canadian newspaper, whatever, they didn't even interview me, they just wrote something. But the reviewer was fascinated by this part, how it seems, and literally something word for word, like they used the word ironically, that ironically, because it was such a gender-segregated society, I knew exactly where I belonged. And that is true. I actually have a friend, I remember when I was at school there, and I was part of this trans support group, and there was this person there, this trans person who grew up also in a Jewish community, but her parents are involved in the Arbeiterring, like the workman circle, and like you're talking like very like hippie, progressive, where gender really had no strong impact as much as possible. And she was saying how also trans and how as a child they were struggling, like they had a feeling, but they couldn't really put it into anything. What does that mean? Because it didn't matter so much to me. I knew quite literally which part of the mechitza, which side of the wall I really should belong. So I think it made it a lot harder in the sense of there was no room to explore. There was no way of like, oh, today I want to put on a certain top that in most places could be considered, you know, androgynous. You can get away with, I don't know, a red-colored shirt maybe for some boys, or maybe even pink if you are okay with presenting gay or whatever, whichever stereotype you buy into, as opposed to in a community where everything is black and white, literally. Like your clothing is black and white and you have to fit into that. And that helped. Ironically, it made it clear, while I didn't know, and I didn't know any other trans people until I was 20, I didn't know that exists. Internally, I knew where I belonged.
And Goldie, there's an LGBT character in your book, one of Suri's sons, and I'm curious how this same idea of the community and of conformity, right? Of this, the reason we're here tonight. I mean, how did that play into that plot point? And how did you know that, you know, the story is about a woman who is pregnant at the age of 57, and that's sort of, and yeah, that's not a spoiler. It's like the first page. But there also is this through line of her son and what happens to him. And so why did you want to put that in the book? And where did it, you know?
Okay, that's a good question.
God, guys, thank you. You're too nice.
All right, so I wanted to put the plot line. I started actually not with the plot line of Suri, but with the plot line of Lipa, who is the young man who's gay in the story. And I started with that because I've been working for probably 10 years now with LGBTQ individuals in the Orthodox community, and mostly from within the Hasidic community. And so I have a lot of youth who come to my home who are, generally speaking, on the way out. They're leaving the community, but they come from all different homes, including from Williamsburg and Monsey and all the different large Jewish communities. And one of the things that I've seen a lot of is kind of the vilification, if you will, of these young kids, often by their families and sometimes by the community, and what happens to them when that happens in their lives, and what role the rejection plays in where they go afterwards, and how they are able to either get an education or not, or how they're able to just live and exist without family. Because, you know, for most people, if you decide not to go in the pathway of your parents, you just leave. You're like, my parents wanted me to go to Dartmouth and they wanted me to become, I don't know, an actuary or something. But sorry, I'm pulling the chain of a relative. But let's say that you wanted to be a sculptor, right? So your parents would be like, darn it. You know, I really wanted my kid to be an actuary and graduate from Dartmouth, but they're a sculptor. All right, okay, fine. So long as they're the best sculptor, I don't care, right? But for a Hasidic family, let's say, who their kid is not only not going to get married to, let's say it's a boy, is not only not going to get married to a woman and have a family and raise Yiddish generations, but that kid is now gay. So in the Hasidic community, that's like a bomb goes off. And mostly the families say, sayonara, we're not going to talk to you ever again. We don't want any part of you or your life or your lifestyle or anything. We don't want you to be part of our community. We don't want you to be part of our family. And you get cut off. And that's a lot to lose. That's so much to lose. And so I see the end result of that in my work. And that's why I wrote that story.
I just need to say thank you first for the work you do, because the conversation is still in the Hasidic community. It's not a question of can I come out, and I have been working with, and I have people reach out. I have people reach out almost on a daily basis, though not all of them are trans, but I have been in touch with at least 24 people who live in ultra-Orthodox communities who are trans, and there's a few people who don't want to leave the community, and I'm at a loss. I don't know what to tell them, because at the moment, that isn't an option, and I don't want to spoil the sad part.
Right. So I want to put it out there. So when I came out in the Hasidic community, it was not a happy moment for me or my family or my community, but I didn't leave. And when I didn't leave, what ended up happening is it became a conversation, right? So I live in a Lubavitch community, which is more modern than the Satmar community, but I stayed in my community, and as a result of staying in my community, my kids' schools had to have meetings where they talked to the parents about how to talk to their kids about queer people and gay people. And that was never a conversation until then.
So I was going to say, in the Hasidic community, and I'm not talking about Chabad. I know Chabad claims to be Hasidic, but
hey!
Sorry, I mean that in the nicest way. At least the way we would say it. I literally heard from teachers more than once, Chabad is a religion very close to Judaism. I don't actually believe that, don't get me wrong. But that was kind of the approach that we had. Point being, in the Hasidic, when I talk about our Hasidic community, and specifically with trans, I think when it comes to being gay, as long as you don't get married, it has changed a bit. But you can't...
A little tiny bit. In the last 10 years, yes. A tiny, tiny bit.
Yeah. Yes, but not a lot. But if you're trans in Williamsburg, it's not a question of how... They're not going to start a conversation with how to deal with your kids. The whole community is going to gang up and make sure you're out. Right. It's not... It's literally impossible.
No, Abby, I know.
But what I wanted to say, though, is and people ask me that a lot, like, and you're right, sometimes you can accomplish a lot by staying. Though when I was coming out, and I remember sitting with my therapist, my coming out story went viral without me expecting it. I was thrown into the spotlight without me expecting it, and I had to decide if I want to reject that or if I want to lean into that and embrace it and try to use it for good. And I was sitting with my therapist, and she is telling me, you need to have a tangible goal. If you're going to become an activist, anyone in the room who does any form of activism, I think you all know that it gets exhausting really fast, specifically if you don't have a tangible goal. So she's like, what's your tangible goal? What's your step one when you're going to feel you have accomplished something? And I'm like, when the Hasidic community, again, I'm talking about Williamsburg, not Crown Heights, when the Hasidic community becomes transphobic. I told her I want Hasidic Williamsburg to be transphobic, which meant I want them to have a conversation about it. Right. Because
you want us to exist.
Exactly.
Because we don't.
And I can say 3 years later, it was mission accomplished. Based on all the emails that I get, and you don't have to trust me, go online, you can usually tell, either by the Yiddish or by the way they write English, you can tell who's Hasidic, and it has happened. There is a conversation, and unfortunately, it isn't loving, and it isn't the conversation that I would hope that could hypothetically happen. And as I describe in the book, the conversation that I have with my parents, but it's a conversation. I know that 12-year-old children in the Hasidic community today would never go through what I went through because I didn't know that other people exist. And I would say another thing that I know how powerful that is, because when I was, and again, I described that a bit more detail, but when I was 12, I also started questioning everything, which was kind of a separate journey that was triggered by my gender identity. And the only way that I knew that obviously I knew hypothetically that there's a world out there, we all know that, but the only way I knew that leaving the community is a possibility is because I had a cousin who left around that time. And he was the first person in my extended family. By extended family, I mean the first person who was a descendant of any of my great-great-grandparents on all sides. That includes over 1,000 people. And the first person to leave was my cousin about 15 to 20 years ago. And I was told everything. He became a criminal. He was mentally ill. He was just crazy. He was a sex addict. There was a whole long list of things that they claimed on what's wrong. But thanks to that, even with all the negativity, I knew that exists. And I was thinking, if I can give that to anyone, if I can give that to a single child, it's worth it. And I've already heard back that that has happened.
Yeah. There's nothing lonelier than thinking you're the only one of something. And I want to say that, like, I think maybe it was 5 years ago or something, there was Oprah, who I don't have a TV, but Oprah said she had an interview with women in Crown Heights. And
in 2012, yeah.
And she said, she asked them, oh, what would you do if your kid came out as gay? And the women basically said, that would never happen. It doesn't happen, it doesn't exist. And one lady said, well, that's pretty extreme, really. And I thought, that reminded me of, like, you know, when I used to write for a Lubavitch publication, and I tried to write something about a young frum man who had been diagnosed with AIDS, HIV/AIDS, and had died because he didn't know anything about sex or sexuality. And I submitted that to this magazine that had published everything of mine religiously for years, and the woman said to me, the publisher said to me, oh, no, that doesn't exist in our community. And I said, go and ask your husband. So she went and asked her husband. She said, okay, fine, it does exist in our community, but we're not publishing it. It doesn't exist in our community.
You know, the irony of all of that is that by now there are a lot of, like, formerly Hasidic or Hasidic, like, LGBTQ groups on Facebook. The only Hasidic community that has a dedicated LGBTQ support group is Chabad, where the woman said on national TV that it doesn't exist. Yeah. So that is the... and also, some of you might have known, like, there was the fight against Jonah, which was this conversion therapy group that got finally shut down. And one of my friends, Chaim Levin, who was one of the people who really fought hard against that, is also from Chabad. So the irony of having Chabad women say that on national TV is just so sweet.
You know, we think a lot about the relationship between parents and their child when they come out as, you know, whatever it is. But what actually happens, and you see it in this book, is, you know, Goldie, your book opens with Suri having, because of what happened with her son, her younger daughter gets a bad match. And so there's this kind of ripple effect that I honestly don't think people who are not part of that community understand, where if you leave or if you are out of the norm in any way, or if you have any mental health issues, it sort of poisons the pool against you of matches, and that's how everything sort of continues. And so can you explain that? I can't imagine that kind of pressure, but it exists in all of these families.
Oh, yeah. So that is something that happens. If something is wrong with your family in any way whatsoever, it could be, you know, your kid is born and they have Down syndrome. Your kid is gay and leaves the community. Your kid leaves, goes off the derech, becomes not religious. You happen to go outside wearing a pair of beige stockings without a seam, or whatever it is, or your skirt is too high, whatever it is. All these different things it marks your social standing in a way that in the external world, the school that you go to, the car that you drive, the jewelry that you wear, whatever, those things mark your social standing. But in a community where those things aren't important, the importance is laid off into, it is, I think, somewhat, money has an impact, but it's not the main impact, right? The main impact is really how religious you are. And this is true in for example, I think this is fascinating. So I have a lot of Amish friends, old order Amish friends. I know it's weird, what can I tell you? And
they're like so similar.
Very similar. So they have the same thing, where the only way that they can stand out in any way, because it's a right-wing community and it's a community that leans towards, very conservative values, the only way that they can stand out is by becoming more religious, by showing more religiosity. That's the true way that they show their social standing, and that's true in the Hasidic world as well.
I talk a bit about it in my book also when it comes to matchmaking, and there's a complex, I guess the only equivalent I can think of, like a caste system that is extremely complex and where every minor detail matters. I think in a family like mine specifically that is kind of like rabbinic, just to start off, the there's probably only 1 or 2% of families within the Hasidic community that my family would ever consider to begin with. And whenever something was added, though, I didn't see, to give an example, my family, it didn't impact that much in the sense of the quality of the matches. There's 2 of my siblings that got engaged and married after I came out, and one other one after I left. And it didn't impact the quality, but it ended up impacting the family. Yeah. They ended up marrying families that my parents would usually not consider, for the lack of a better word, they would not consider them royal enough, or not consider they're not such a high status family. But because of my family status as a whole, they can get away with having a kid like me because of that. Which ends up adding.
That's not true for. Oops, I'm sorry. That's not true for families that don't have that kind of yichus. Families that are just ordinary families in the community. I mean, I had a child who was in my first grade class, and he was not from one of these, the kind of families that Abby came from, and he clearly had some things going on with him. And I called in the parents and I said, you're going to need to take your kid for counseling because of this and this thing. I don't want to be too revealing about what it was, but this kid needs some help. And the parents sat there very seriously frowning, and then they said, we can't do that because he'll never get married if we do that. And so that's sort of where it's at, where people really feel that if you do something, or if you show something, or if you behave in a certain way, you're going to lose the ability to marry decently. Yeah. And that's a huge pressure. If you think about who you married, you got the free choice, right? You got to choose who you wanted to marry. That's not exactly true in the Hasidic world.
It's usually not true at all.
All right.
And I want to say,
yeah,
I'm now for the first time, and it could be the book. I don't know. I hope not. But I still have 2 sisters that are not married, and my sister now, she's still 18, but she's about to turn 19 in 3 months. And
totally on the shelf.
She's the oldest one, the oldest of any of my siblings. She's number 11. She's the oldest anyone was and still single, which is, it's scary almost.
So I have another question, but I want to encourage you all to write your questions down. Now's a good time. And then JBC staff will come around and collect them. So, Abby, a question for you. You describe in the book, you sort of leave the Hasidic community, right? You go off the derech, as the term is. Yeah. And then 2 years later, you come out as transgender. So 3 years, okay. So can you describe those 2 different processes? And did you have to do one to get to the other? I mean, they're similar in a lot of ways, but they're very different.
Well, okay, contrary to maybe what some people might think, there's no cookie-cutter process of leaving the community, and I think that is actually getting even less and less so the more people leave. There's every single person who leaves, every single person who comes out, which I think is true in the LGBT community as a whole, and even more so in the Hasidic community. Everyone has their own process. For me, there were 2 parts that went hand in hand. There was a part of me throughout my life that was kind of trying to pray the gay away, so to speak, in different ways. That was kind of hoping that if I do X, Y, and Z, it's going to go away. And I talk a bit about it. Before I got married, I was sure that maybe if I just get married, my feelings, I don't know, it's going to magically change. Later, I was thinking if I just leave, if I get an education, there was all these things that I kept thinking that I knew it's not going to work, but I was just hoping. Because here's the thing, even after leaving the community, coming out, transitioning I have a bit of a culture shock after I left, both in the sense of realizing how bad sexism is in the outside world, which legitimately shocked me. I wrote an article about it for Glamour a few weeks ago, which I was not expecting, but also realizing that even the outside world is not so friendly to trans people. And to be honest, back in 2012, when I left, it was even worse. People sometimes don't realize that. And I just wrote a foreword for a book called Trans New York that's coming out in a few weeks. And I discussed that in there as well, where between 2012 and 2015, the general population, the American kind of awareness of trans people became way better and way more enhanced. You're talking everything from TV shows like Real Representation, shows like Transparent, Sense8, Orange is the New Black, even Caitlyn Jenner, like all of these things happened between 2012 and 2015. So it was a very different world, and I was legitimately terrified of it. And also part of me knew that first leaving and establishing myself in the outside world will help. I had amazing help and support from, when I left it was mostly from Footsteps, which is a New York-based nonprofit that is, someone is clapping, thank you. Footsteps is a literal life-saving organization that helped me a lot. By the time I came out in 2015, I was already living in Manhattan. I was at pretty much a secular college. I was having friends. It was, if I had to think back, maybe transitioning earlier would have been a bit better in some ways, but at least in emotional and cultural ways, it was a blessing to do it that way and to like divide them and split them into two steps.
So since you're both out, you're on your book tours, you're public, right? You're reachable. What are the things that people are saying? Like, what are the, when someone comes up to you and says, Abby, thank you so much. I didn't know that this was possible, and I saw, I read your story, and now I feel safe and feel a community. If someone reads any of your work, Goldie, and is that a lot of pressure to have on you, to not just be signing books, but to be giving like very, very serious advice?
I like to tell this story just because for me it's very moving, and I hope it's moving actually for you too, Abby. There's at a certain point in my life recently, a lot of people were coming to my house, and one of the people who came to my house was a Hasidic woman, a Satmar woman in her 90s, and she came and she said, I didn't realize there'd be this many people in your house, but I want to tell you something. I got hold of your book because I heard that one of my relatives is in it, or I was like, no relatives are in it. And she said, but I read through the whole thing, and I loved it. It was me. It was my life. I loved that book. And I kept on crying and telling my husband about it and telling my husband about it. And he's a 90-year-old Satmar rabbi who has never read an English book, no novels, no English books, nothing like that. And she said, and eventually he said to me, read it to me. Read me that book. And so she read it to him. And at the end, he was crying, and he said, read it again.
Thank you. I can read you a few, but I literally get messages on a daily basis. I'm looking like, this is not even about the book, but it's someone who is obviously Hasidic based on the way they write. I love watching your stories and get really inspired. I got one today. Hi, I just wanted to message and let you know how much I enjoyed your book. You should be proud of yourself or whatever. And you are an inspiration. Also someone who is at least Orthodox based on the way they write. And I get these literally on a daily basis. And not all of them are, there is the part where there's the responsibility. But I think by now I've made it clear enough to people that I'm not perfect. I'm not trying to be perfect. And the biggest part that I'm trying to do is to let people know that they're not alone, to let people know that they are options if they want to. And I see it on a daily basis.
All right, let's see what we got here.
Can I do something
Yes,
first?
yes.
Okay, can I get a volunteer, someone who identifies as cisgender and straight and feels comfortable having a conversation with me up here? Anyone in the room? Ideally, you're really comfortable being straight. Okay. Yeah? Did you want to? Don't worry, I'm not going to kill you. I'm not going to try to. I always tell people if I want to judge you, I will do it silently, not loudly. You don't have to. Okay, thank you. Yes.
Great necklace. Oh, perfect.
Oh.
Here. Take the mic.
Hi.
Okay, hi.
Hi, I'm Abby. What's your name?
I'm Rosie.
Great meeting you.
Me too.
So what's your sexuality?
I'm straight.
Are you sure about that?
I'm pretty sure.
How old were you when you realized you were straight?
Now.
Oh. Maybe you just haven't met the right girl yet. Like, how do you know if you haven't tried?
I think I know.
Were your parents okay with you when you came out to them as straight?
I never came out.
Wow. Do you plan on coming out? Do you think they're going to be okay with it?
I don't know.
Okay, that's important. I've one
I think they know.
They know and they're fine with it. How nice of them. Oh my God. How does it work? Like, how do straight people like have sex? Like, I just don't get it. You don't have to answer that one. Thank you. Thank you so much. The reason why I do that, I get a lot when and I've done like hundreds of these events, and people always want to know which kind of questions can you ask. So I usually tell people there's 2 rules. If you don't know if you can ask something, you probably can, so don't. But also, think before that if you would ask that from someone who isn't trans, from someone who isn't queer. And I think the same goes for any minority, whatever it's about race, about immigration, about social status, whatever that is. Think if you would ask that from someone who is part of the, let's say, the majority group. I usually say at events, and I know it for yourself, I don't mind questions, and that's the point. That's part of the work that I'm doing. I usually say you can ask me anything. I don't have to answer everything. And I mean that because part of my work, I do want to answer these questions. But as a whole, when you meet someone who is trans or queer, and I would say the same, you meet someone who left the Hasidic community, which tends to happen a lot, and a lot of my friends have that. Specifically, I'm going to assume that some people in the room are members of the wider Jewish community, and I know a lot of people who try to go to events in the Jewish community end up saying that they feel that the only thing that, I don't know, they go to this Reform temple, and the only thing people are interested in is their exotic details of their life. It's important, unless someone puts themselves out there, which I am, but unless they do that, think twice before asking a question.
Okay, this is a very good question to whoever asked it. How does the Hasidic community reconcile that we are all created in God's image with the discrimination you discussed regarding marriage, alienation, etc.? Who wants it? Who goes first?
The most hate, ironically, the most hate I got from, at least my first year after I left, the most hate I got from the Hasidic community, or sorry, I don't want to say the Hasidic community because it's not a homogenous, from people in the Hasidic community was not for coming out, not for going on national TV and talking about it, but for releasing a source sheet that was looking on gender and genderqueerness in religious Jewish texts in a more nuanced or open way, in a way that a lot of people don't want to think about. And they're still available. I can give the link to anyone. That angered people more than anything else. And I think when you read a book, you get that point. I had the conversation with my dad also. Their bigger issue is their culture as opposed to religion. It's a certain framework that you have to fit in. Imagine this. Even if you want to look, and if I try to think of my rabbinical studies, there's a lot more that you can throw at someone for being gay, not lesbian actually, but specifically gay, than for being trans. Yet most Hasidic people that I know have a bigger issue with being trans because it's a bigger challenge to the way they see the world, at least in my experience.
And I would like to add that I think that the Hasidic community, and in fact the Jewish community in general, has made some strides towards acceptance in the past 5 years or so. I know, at least in Chicago, I live in Chicago, the Jewish community, including the Hasidic community, had a rabbi come out from...
How does this not come up before?
What's that?
Chicago? Do you know the Ungers? West
Of
Rogers
course I
Park?
know the Ungers.
She's my aunt and uncle.
Of course I know the Ungers.
The Vates in a Cheder
Please.
was founded by my grandfather. You know that.
I know.
Oh, okay.
Anyway, I know. Anyway, so what I wanted to say was that at least in the Hasidic community in Chicago, they had one of the head rabbis from London, from the London-based Inn, come out and speak about including queer people in the Orthodox and Hasidic communities. And he came and he spoke to a packed room. It was over 700 people, including all the rabbis from the big communities. And he said, basically, we have handled this incorrectly for years. This is not how it needs to be handled. What we need to have is we need to include these people. We need to include queer people in our communities. They should not lose their families. They should not lose their homes, their jobs, their communities, their religion, their God, and certainly not their health. And so
now we have to bring him to Williamsburg. I can't see that happen, but I wish. Yeah.
Right. So and he brought sources from the Torah. He brought sources and he said, "Here, you tell me why we're doing that."
I have over 50 source sheets online that deal with this issue, and I love text. I love Jewish text. I do that a lot, and I've taught them over 100 times. And it's just so interesting to see how people react to that, because, and that's what I always tell people, if you want to accept people, religion will never be in your way. I don't think people are bigoted because they're religious. And I know a lot of my friends who grew up religious and have left always love to blame religion. And I could sit here the whole night and complain about religion if I want to, but I don't think religion is the problem when it comes to LGBTQ community, but it's culture and people's preconceived notions that are just wrong when it comes to our community, as opposed to hardcore religious beliefs.
Yeah, I want to say it's fear of the unknown. Because if there are no queer people in the Orthodox or the Hasidic community, right? Remember the Oprah interview. If there are no people, then you're afraid of it because you don't know anything about it. But right now, at least in Chicago, there's a queer person in the Hasidic community. Hello, that's me. And right now, at least in the Williamsburg community, there are plenty of people who know about Abby. So that the fear factor goes down. It just goes down because we're visible.
There have already been people, and I said, like, going back to the conversation with my therapist, like, goal number 1 was Hasidic community becomes transphobic. Goal number 2, though, in a more legitimate, in a more real way, is that people could come out and not be shunned by their families, which was almost unthinkable when I came out. But literally just a few years later, I know of a few people who have come out as trans after that, and their family still talks to them in one way or another. I know a few where the family doesn't, but there is both, and that is happening.
So that leads us to this nice double question that I've mashed together. So without addressing the LGBT issue, I would like to know, why do Hasidim leave the religion altogether? Why don't they just become more modern, as in modern Orthodox? Second one. Does the average person that leaves the Hasidic community also leave the observant practice of mitzvot, or is there a big community of defectors where they can still observe? So this question is, what happens? Where do you go after? Can you still be religious?
Okay, wow, such a big question, right, Abby? So I think this is actually different within different Hasidic communities. It's totally different. So within many Hasidic communities, there isn't a secular education, which there isn't a secular education, and there is a lot of very intense feelings and of connection to a particular way of worshiping. And so many times when those kids leave, they leave with a bang, because there isn't something that's analogous to that in the outside world. Yeah. And so they don't feel like they fit in with, let's say, a conservative or a modern or a reform community. They're like, this isn't what I think of as Shabbos or whatever. And so they leave with a bang. They're like, nope, I'm done. I'm out. It's pork on Yom Kippur for me. Right? Sorry.
That's in the book. You know that, right?
I know. So, but then there are other people, and it really, what I actually think is true is that people who are less right-leaning in the Hasidic world, like if they're more moderate or just regular Orthodox people, when they leave, they don't leave with a bang. They're more likely to become more modern, just kind of tip over into sort of Orthodox conservative thing, because their mode of worship wasn't so particular, and so they can fit in anywhere. But somebody who grew up Satmar, somebody who grew up Lubavitch, just says, I'm out.
Well, here's the thing about me. So for those who know me, and I know there's a few people here from Romemu, I have been a member of a Jewish community here in Manhattan for 5 years. I am very, very involved and very engaged in the Jewish community. I don't like or need to put a label on it. If I really have to, I will probably use Jewish Renewal because it is so flexible and it kind of is the closest thing. But I very much do my own thing. Though for 2 years after I left, and one of the rabbis who I would consider my rabbi now calls it post-God traumatic disorder, which is a very, very real thing. And I think a lot of people that I know have this visceral traumatic reaction. And to give you an example, a place like Footsteps, who really tries to serve everyone, as opposed to what some people in the Hasidic community think, they're not trying to make people be less religious in any way. And at pretty much at all of their events, they are kosher options for food. But a few years ago, there was a whole conversation where some members complained that it's triggering to them. And it really is. Because as controversial this might sound, having kosher food. They go to Footsteps and they don't want to see kosher food. And a lot of us might be like, what do you mean? Why you care? Don't eat it. But it is. And I remember for myself, about a year after I left, and I was at this hangout on a Thursday night, and someone served tion, and I had a physical traumatic reaction to it.
Everybody has a physical traumatic reaction.
Well, but though a few years later, if you check my Instagram, I do love it, though. So I think but ultimately I've gotten that question. People who are modern Orthodox ask, why don't you become modern Orthodox? People who are conservative ask, why don't you become conservative? Why? Ultimately, what is important, don't think of the Hasidic community as, people like to think a lot of it as like Reform, conservative, modern Orthodox, ultra-Orthodox. You can't look on it that way. If you want to look on that like a line, which I don't think really exists, it's more nuanced than that, but you want to look on that line and you got Reform, conservative, modern Orthodox, then there's a cult that has some relationships.
That is not Lubavitch.
I'm not talking about Lubavitch. I'm not talking about people who believe that dead people are still alive. I'm not touching that. But and really, at least in the cultural sense, and I'm not talking, they're not a Jonah style cult. I'm not stupid. They're not the kind of cult you expect to see on TV. But a lot of the mentality, growing up, I didn't know any difference between modern Orthodoxy and Reform and humanistic and secular Jews. There was us. There were the modern Jews, which for us were the ultra-Orthodox yeshivish people, which are, and maybe Chabad. And then there were all the other secular Jews who were really terrible, and it didn't matter. There really was no difference. So I think even for a lot of us who do have, and I think I have a very healthy and very proud relationship with Judaism, both spiritually, culturally, and communally, it took me 2 years of I can look at challenge to be able to find my own path. And I see that happen. I do see that happening more and more. This can be a whole conversation. There was just a big conference. Footsteps had a conference a few weeks ago, and that kept coming up. And there is a growing percentage of people who create our own paths within Judaism.
Okay, so we have a lot of questions here about contact with family members, relationships with family members. And so briefly tell us, but then let's end with this. Do you think the community could change to accommodate differences? What could be done? Do you see a potential path besides conforming or leaving? And then everyone gets to go buy your book and then sign it. Okay, take us home.
Do you want to go first?
I think that when it comes to this idea that, can the community be more flexible? Can they be open to the idea that there are people who don't worship exactly like them, but they're still sort of part of the community? I think that's already starting to happen. I really think that that's starting to happen. And, there's a Yiddish expression, azoi kristel sich, azoi yidel sich, just like the outside world goes, so the Jewish world eventually goes. So I think that the LGBTQ acceptance started maybe 20, 30 years ago in the outside world. And now, we're starting to see it here in the Jewish world, the Hasidic world. And so I do think that there are these changes. Like, I know for sure that there are changes because my kids, initially had a very difficult time in school. When I came out, it was like, like a bomb went off. But then I have a married son who's a rabbi, and I have events in my home where the whole community comes and they eat my food. So again, that's radical,
Chabad,
right?
But
that's radical. But even within Chabad, that's radical.
Yeah.
Right?
So here, I think I do think a lot about that within the Hasidic community. And again, not talking about Chabad. I do love Chabad, and I have had some very positive, some very negative, but also some very positive. And I like to focus on the positive specifically. I like to give you an example. I don't know if you know the Blums, the Chabad family at Columbia, who have been outstandingly supportive. So like there is, but in the communities that I come from, I think there's two steps, so to speak. There's the community as a whole. I do think that for people that it's becoming, I don't see it in the near future where people are going to be even openly like gay, at least married in the community would accept that. But I do see it happening more and more that the families will talk to them, that the community members, their friends, as opposed to when I came out, I lost everyone. To the community as a whole, I do think there's a paradigm shift happening. There's a split almost, kind of what happened after the war, and suddenly we had modern Orthodoxy and ultra-Orthodoxy. That is kind of happening in the Hasidic community. We have a whole growing group of people. We call them tuna bagels. I'm not going to explain that right now, but it's ultimately, imagine a version of modern Hasidic. I have some siblings who would fit into that category. It's kind of happening. It's hard to know exactly, but I do think that parts and families and communities within the community are becoming more open. And then, unfortunately, at the same time, almost as a reaction to that, you have other parts in the Hasidic community that are becoming more radical. And with them, it's a whole other story. But I do think that, and I see myself, like I have cousins who speak to me. I have a first cousin who is kind of, I'm not going to say his name, but he's pretty much becoming like a star, like a musical rock star in the Hasidic, I know rock, not rock necessarily, but the equivalency of a rock star in the Hasidic community. Has released albums, one of the highest, if not the highest paying Hasidic singers internally within the community. And he has a good relationship with me, and so on. It is happening more and more. But then at the same time, 10 out of my 12 siblings wouldn't talk to me, and my parents wouldn't pick up the phone. So I think there's kind of a split happening, which is good and also bad at the same time.
Let's end on good and also bad at the same time. I want to invite up Susan Weidman-Schneider. She's the editor-in-chief and one of the founders of Lilith. She's going to take us home. And thank you, Goldie. Thank you, Abby. This is really, really amazing.
Stephanie, you were amazing. Thank you.
Brava. Really. What a fabulous evening. On behalf of Lilith Magazine's board and staff and writers and artists, so many of whom are here today, I want, first of all, to thank Stephanie and Abby and Goldie, whose work has appeared in Lilith's pages. What an amazing evening. And to invite you all to celebrate with us with refreshments, to toast Lilith's new winter issue, and please to take a copy. So please come and party. Woo!